Hello, and welcome to the COP30 newsroom here at High House, live from the Green Zone in Belém. Every morning, we're giving you the rundown on the biggest stories of the day with a selection of climate journalists from around the world. Joining us today are Fiona McCraith, Director of the Climate Pledge at Global Optimism and co-host of Inside COP, the official COP30 podcast, Matteo Civillini, reporter at Climate Home News, and Thais Lara, reporter at Info Amazonia. Thanks all very much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Now, let's get stuck into the first story, shall we? Now, pressure is building here for fossil fuel transition plan at COP30. Matteo, this is your story in Climate Home News. Tell us about it.
So there was a strong call yesterday from more than 80 countries to put this idea of a process to start a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels in the final decision to come out here of Belém. There's been sort of discussions behind the scenes about this over the last few weeks. It's an idea that's been floated originally by Minister Marina Silva of Brazil, and several other countries have been working on it. It was surprising in a way to see such a public and strong showing of support for it yesterday. And clearly, the goal was to put pressure on the presidency to bring this forward on the sort of formal agenda or for the political package that they are trying to deliver by the end of today. It is building on what countries agreed to at COP28, but that sort of commitment in a way that was made then has not been followed up, at least within the UN climate regime. And there's been a strong pushback from fossil fuel producing countries on even just repeating the same pledge that was made at COP28. And so it's interesting to see these dynamics. And it will be interesting to see today and in the next few days how this develops further, because obviously we've heard now from the countries that want to put this idea on the table on the negotiated outcome. But then we need to hear from the other side. And there's clearly be again like blowback and pushback from fossil producing countries. And as the president Correa Lagos said last night, this is clearly a very divisive issue, and there are some that want very strong language, very strong text on this, and there are some other countries for which this is a red line and it's unacceptable. It's interesting how these are sort of snuck up on the summit in a way. And I was speaking to various country delegations, and they also themselves were surprised how prominent it has become. And even the EU, for example, doesn't really have a joint position on supporting a roadmap. Some individual member states do, but not the whole bloc.
Yeah. So really, lots of different positions. Thais, how do you see this coming together today? How do you see the roadmap to the roadmap playing out today?
I mean, which of all of the roadmaps, right? I mean, there are a lot of roadmaps, and most here they are talking about the roadmap like to fossil fuels. But for example, we have a previous one on finance, that it was the roadmap to the Back to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion that was mentioned on the NCQG. And it's going to be interesting what is going to happen with that, because basically so far it was just only a report with recommendation about how to scale up finance. But I would say that today it will be interesting to see what happened with finance, because it's an item itself, but it's also in other items of the agenda and is connected with everything.
Yeah. And plenty more on finance later. But quickly, Fiona, what's your view on the fossil fuel roadmap? Are you optimistic that there'll be something in the final text? What do you see playing out?
Yeah. I mean, roadmaps are basically a map of how you get from point A to point B. We know that we need to get to point B because, frankly, in Dubai, it was already agreed that we would be phasing out fossil fuels. So the fact that it's a surprise to countries is a little bit of a surprise to me, because they agreed to it 2 years ago. So I really, really commend Minister Marina Silva and President Lula and the presidency for driving this forward. I commend the 80 parties that have committed to wanting to be a part of these discussions, to pressuring this, as the headline says. But even more than that, I think the crucial part of this is that it creates a dialogue and a forum to have the really hard conversations about how do you phase out fossil fuel, whether you import it or export it. So whether you're relying on imports for sustainable, secure and reliable energy and electricity in your country, or whether you're relying on it because that's what your economy runs on. Those are very complex, complicated issues. And I'm really glad that that conversation is being cracked open at this COP. And hopefully we do get a roadmap. And I would say I am optimistic.
Well, glad to hear. Now let's move on to the next story then. Thijs, this is something you wanted to talk about. With the headline in Le Monde, halfway through COP30 is poisoned by finance. Now, finance has been a really important issue at COP for many years. Why is it an issue again this year?
I mean, finance is the heart of the negotiations, especially because it's what track the multilateral climate relations between developing countries and developed countries. And in every COP, we need to remember how the previous COP ended. And last year in Baku, they decided the NCQG, like the new financial climate goal. And most of developing countries, they were not satisfied with the result. They think that it was not as ambitious as they wanted and they needed. So now you can see that is impacting like in all the discussions, especially about what we are from yesterday here in this text, that is the multi-round decision, that it contains the discussions on those 4 items that were not part of like the formal agenda, but that basically are part of all the discussion and the calendar. So one of those 4 items is Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement that says that developed countries have responsibility to mobilize money to developing countries. So what developing countries are trying like to insist here is to have something concrete on that responsibility and the mobilization of public money. Because the issue is that the NCQG, that goal of the $300 billion, it could be from all sources, public, private, bilateral, multilateral. So they want something concrete on that. But then at the same time, you have the discussion on adaptation finance, in which some developing countries are asking like to tripling the flows of finance. Some other countries, they don't want to talk again about finance. And in all of that, we need like always to analyze the COP not as a bubble and try to understand also what's the geopolitical context. US is not here, so US is not going like to be part, at least in the coming years, as donor. So some developed countries are a little like alone on that now.
And Matteo, I mean, Thijs just mentioned adaptation finance. It's often been seen as the slightly poor relation of climate finance. What's your view on how adaptation finance is being worked through at this COP?
Well, this COP was meant to be the COP of adaptation, in theory, as the presidency presented it. And adaptation finance is a very important component of it. There is a technical work being done on some indicators to basically track progress on countries' efforts to sort of become more resilient to climate change. But understandably, many developing countries are saying we are not going to want to be burdened with more work if there's no money there to actually adapt to climate change. So finance is a clear component. And there is a strong call, as Thijs was saying, from the world's poorest countries especially, to boost adaptation finance. Now, as Thijs was saying, the geopolitics are complicated. A lot of finance for adaptation comes from aid budgets, from public government's money. And those budgets are shrinking in basically everywhere, in Europe especially. And a lot of money was coming from USAID, which doesn't exist anymore now, essentially. So it's a very tricky geopolitical scenario. And clearly, there needs to be a deal on adaptation finance, but a lot more work needs to be done to find that.
Fiona, what's your view?
I mean, one, countries are unified in requesting a tripling of adaptation finance to $120 billion by 2030. That shouldn't be that. That is not an absurd ask. That's a very reasonable ask. And these are perennial issues, and they're so interconnected. And I think the way the presidency is seeking to address that in their Muchirao decision draft is really brilliant because the whole Muchirao is about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, and calling upon that, which has really been a through line of their presidency, I think is brilliant diplomacy. We'll see if it works out. But back to finance, I think one of the things that I've been really reflecting on, and we've been talking about a lot in Inside COP, is the fact that you have the negotiations, and it's easy to silo them from what's happening in the real world. And I think on adaptation finance, it's actually a very interesting example where the public sector is so far behind also what the private sector needs in this space as guarantees and concessional finance to enable, for example, insurance companies who are responsible for navigating and insuring a lot of increasingly uninsurable places, having dialogues that are already happening. There's been such demand from the private sector. So I think it's not only responding to the demands of these countries that are unified, it's also saying, hey, it's about a lot of other businesses, including those that are headquartered in important, rich countries, to kind of come together. We're looking for leadership from you right now on this. So, we'll see what happens, but I hope that both the party call, but also the private sector call will help mobilize more finance.
So we talked about Muchirao, we talked about adaptation. Let's finish our game of COP30 bingo and talk about implementation. Let's have the next headline. Keeping promises on renewables, energy efficiency and methane would avoid nearly 1 degree Celsius of global heating. Now, we're talking a lot about implementation here, but really this is about delivering on the promises that have already been made. How can that happen at a COP? Is that happening at this COP? Thais, what's your view?
I think we need to understand what the COPs are, because sometimes it's like people think, it even happens, I think it's one of my first COP and my mouth was like, did you say the word? And I was like, no, really, I mean, that is not what happened at the COP. And sometimes the expectations are not what should happen at the COP. And you mentioned implementation. Since the Paris Agreement, we already have an agreement. Now every COP is more complex, more technical, because it's about the implementation of these little items that are a lot. So I think that we need to understand that we need progress on that. So for example, in terms of the transition, it's really important to see what is going to happen with the Just Transition Work Program and how to make the transition more inclusive for everyone. And of course, the implementation is not easy because it's not the same how an energy transition could be in South America than maybe in Europe, and not even in a country it will be the same. So I think I will say that it's important to see this is not that we need a new agreement. We should see the general consensus on these items for the implementation, and always understand that when the COP ends, it's where the real action of those decisions begin.
Now, one of the points mentioned in the headline there is methane. Matteo, that's often seen as one of the more harder greenhouse gases to abate. Does this make it clear just how important that conversation is as well?
Yeah, I mean, methane is a subject that comes up often in COP and in various pledges around COP. The problem, what I would focus on is that this confirms what we already know, that we know what we need to do to cut emissions and limit global warming. But the emphasis on the if implemented, because on methane, for example, there has been various pledges. There has been some sort of progress in some quarters, but actually methane emissions have been increasing since those pledges have been made. And there are many tools now available to track methane emissions, especially in the oil and gas sector. There are satellites that can pinpoint where there are leakages, and so it's sort of inexcusable, especially in developed, richer countries, that these are not tackled. But not enough is still being done. And for example, UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, they have a very good initiative that through satellites they track methane emissions. They could tell in which specific bit of infrastructure they're coming from, and they send alerts to governments or companies that run those assets. And last year, only 10% of those alerts actually received an acknowledgement. It doesn't even mean that they actually fixed the problem, but they're getting ignored. So it's about as the implementation is about the political will and the commitment of governments and companies to actually do it.
I think we'll move on to our next story now. Fiona, this is yours. The headline, Clamour for Change Inside the World's COP30 Climate Negotiations. Now, this is really about COP reform, and there's a really interesting quote in the article. One European negotiator said, this is the last of the old COPs and the beginning of the new. Fiona, talk us through this.
Yeah, I mean, even referencing back to the conversation and the remarks that Tice made, I mean, COPs are and must look different than what they once were. We have the Paris Agreement. That is set. It's been negotiated in the years past to set the rule book. We now have the cycles of the global stocktake and the NDCs that help us chart out. We have long-term strategies. Like, there are all of these elements of Paris that enable the negotiations to continue, but primarily to continue as forums for these types of roadmaps to raise ambition, as accountability mechanisms for maintaining pledges that have been made, for including those on finance, and for parties to come together and knowledge share. And then I think there are also COPs. What surrounds the COPs are lots of people have called them kind of trade shows. You know, there are examples of action that's happening in the real world, which I'll just say is outside of the COP. It includes not just governments, but also the private sector, civil society. And I think there's this clamor for change, which I think, you know, every headline sensationalizes a little bit. I think that's just a natural process of kind of looking up and saying, wow, this process has really served us well. We actually achieved what we needed to achieve within this process. And now we're going to have to evolve because the world is changing and we need to keep up with what is really happening in the real world. The new economy is already rising. I mean, here at COP, 80 billion in grid and storage pledged, 140 billion in clean industrial projects, 33% of those in emerging economies. South Korea committed to ending coal use through the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Those are just a few examples of the fact that around COP, there's so much momentum. And I think we'll see that adjust. There's just one other thing I want to say, that there were 3 Rio conventions that were created. Climate, which is UNFCCC, we're there right now. Biodiversity and desertification. Those 3 are all happening next year. That's a major moment for them to come together and to reimagine this. And I would just invite parties to do this not in a way that enables lobbyists or, you know, governments that have left the Paris Agreement to come in and take that over, but to really think collectively about what does imagining this to meet the future moment look like.
Matteo, what's your view on that? What would a new COP look like?
I think there is a need for change for sure, and there are many ideas and options on there. Streamline the agenda, as Fiona was saying, bring in different actors, make it more of an implementation forum, sharing of knowledge and information. I think there needs to be care and attention to how this process and conversation is carried out, because there is already skepticism outside of this world of what COP is. You always hear every year, oh, why is everyone flying to this place to like talk about stuff without any tangible achievement? So you don't want to sort of give in to that narrative and kind of hand to like score an own goal essentially. So there needs to be some reform, some process, but there needs to be a critical balance on how that conversation is carried forward.
Now, we're going to move on to our final story now. This was a story we picked out just before the show. Australia says it would not block Turkey as COP host. We've actually been hearing reports during the show that Australia may now have conceded, although they're not confirmed. Now, the next COP has been a battle between Australia and Turkey. But Matteo, I mean, what's your view on this and the conversation about the next COP and where it's going to be hosted? What are the merits of both presidencies, Australia, Turkey, and what's your view on what might happen next?
I mean, clearly, neither of them wants to give in. There is a clear backing for the Australian bid, like all the countries within the group that needs to reach by consensus a decision is backing the Australia and Pacific Islands bid. And about, as I said, the decision needs to be made by consensus. So if Turkey doesn't withdraw its bid, it will still be in contention. I think it's important that a decision is reached quickly. I mean, it's already too late, but quickly. Also because to show that multilateralism works and that countries are united, and that in this world of COP, countries are not also arguing on who should host and sort of any kind of ego-driven narrative. So it's important to come out of COP or as soon as possible with a clear decision on who is going to be hosting next year.
Tace, what's your view?
I think that when we talk about the presidencies, we are always thinking about where the COP is going to be held physically, in which city, the locations. But here also, and the most important, we are talking about the role of presidency of the COP, and it will really sad not to have a consensus necessary to have a next presidency. Because basically the presidency of the COP is the one who coordinates the work at the COP, as the Brazil is doing right now. I mean, during the first hours of this morning, I have been hearing a lot of different options. I think we need to wait and see. Meanwhile, the other negotiations are happening. If there's consensus in the group, and as Matteo said, I totally agree, it will be great. It will be a good sign to show that multilateralism work, and that the regional group that has to decide, make a decision on that. And always, I would say it will be great, to have the COP in a place in where freedom of express and press freedom, is guaranteed.
I mean, Fiona, we're just talking about COP reform. I mean, the choosing of the host of COP has been something that's really overshadowed in some ways here, and then, of course, previously in Dubai when they were choosing between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Is this something that is being talked about in terms of COP reform, in terms of how a host country is selected, in terms of how the presidency is selected?
I mean, I think the question of the regions is an interesting one. There are 5 regions in the UN, and that's how it rotates in alphabetical order who hosts. And I think, it's an interesting, we're in the Western Europe and other groups for this one. So it's kind of just I personally am of the view, I'm not sure that represents the reality of the world anymore. And I would invite that to be a part of it. I have no idea if it is. I think what's most important, as someone who believes very deeply in the importance of the presidency, absolutely, as Tice was saying, that whichever country is the host picks up that mantle and feels the weight of the responsibility of leadership and carrying out what has been determined here and in the past to deliver ambitious, continued, connected action from these negotiations. Because we are in this moment where people are wondering, how are these going to help meet the moment and meet the future we need?
So meeting the moment and the future we need, that sounds a good way to end. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, both today and here at COP30. Thanks so much for joining us over the last 10 days in High House here in Belém. Special thanks to all of our panelists and, of course, all of you for watching at home. Will we see you in Adelaide or Antalya next? Who knows? Goodbye for now.